Good morning and welcome to the 2020 VCOS Treasurer's Budget Breakfast. My name's Emma King, I'm the CEO of VCOS and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. I would like to acknowledge that I am here today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and to all Aboriginal people who are with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge that of course sovereignty has never been ceded. It's my absolute pleasure to throw to your host, Nine News Victorian political reporter Andrew Lund. But first, what a few weeks it's been.
There's no better time than the present to deal with problems associated with injustice and inequality. We have to start, and we have to start now.
The biggest boost to social and affordable housing in the history of our country.
This is a massive mental health budget.
A major overhaul of disability education funding.
$250 one-off.
So not only is it the right thing to do for the people of Victoria, it's also the right thing to do for our economy.
Kindergarten will be free for all Victorian families next year.
A Get Active Kids voucher program.
We can build a system that is fairer.
People matter more than the bottom line.
Hello, I'm Andrew Lund. Whether you're joining us on the VCOS website, Facebook or Twitter, welcome. Tim Pallas has had a pretty unenviable job this year. He's had to preside over two effective shutdowns of the Victorian economy and watch as the government's revenue stream dried up. He now faces the task of rebuilding the Victorian economy, but also rebuilding Victorians themselves. As the saying goes, though, you should never waste a crisis, and he used Tuesday's budget to make some significant investments in the state's future and also present some significant reforms. We'd love for you to submit a question to the Treasurer. If you're on the VCOS website, just use the Slido box underneath this video. You can do this anonymously if you want. If you're on Facebook or Twitter, just reply or comment and the team will see it. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we will try our best. It is now my pleasure to welcome the Victorian Treasurer, Tim Pallas. Treasurer, thanks for your time. We'll get to those questions shortly, but first, I'd like you to present just a brief overview of what the budget contains, particularly some of its social policy commitments.
Sure, Andrew, and thanks very much for the introduction. I'd like also to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are individually meeting and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And once again, thanks to VCOS for organising today's event. It looks like this is becoming a very regular part of our budget, post-budget offering. And I've got to tell you, I very much enjoy the opportunity to put forward the government's views around the social elements and the broader community elements of the budget. So VCOS has been working with and for its members throughout this difficult year. Thanks to Emma and her team for their work. I'd also like to thank VCOS for its ongoing engagement with the government. The discussions that we have are always practical and forward-looking. I found them to be incredibly insightful and informative over the years. I'd also like to thank Andrew for hosting us today. Emma noted on Tuesday that this budget is literally brimming with positive, smart and effective social policy measures which will make real inroads into poverty and disadvantage. Whilst it's extremely positive feedback, in fact, right up there with the best of it, it's also a reflection of the year that we've all collectively had to live through and experience. It's asked more of us than we could have ever have imagined. It's tested us in ways that we never thought it could. That's why it demanded a budget like never before. This budget is about helping Victorians find work, ensuring not just a job, but security and certainty for them and the people that they love. It's about looking after families, making sure that they can have confidence in their future and a future for their kids. It's about taking care of the people that we love most and ensuring that if the worst were to happen, we know that they'll have the care that they need. It's about building a strong recovery and an even stronger future for our state. Like so many countries around the world, and the global pandemic has resulted in quite serious impacts to our economy. I'm sure that comes as no surprise to most Victorians who've been doing it incredibly tough over the last 12 months. The unemployment rate is forecast to peak at 8.25% in the December quarter and average 7.75% in 2021. Our economy is forecast to contract by about 4% in 2021, following a small decline in 1920. Metropolitan Melbourne experienced the greatest falls in employment, as well as tourism-exposed regional areas such as around the Great Ocean Road, Daylesford, the Alpine Resorts and the Yarra Valley. Employment declined by 6.5%, or 175,000 people in Melbourne, compared to 2%, or 15,000 people in regional Victoria from the March to September quarters. So communities in the state's east and north were also dealt the double blow of the coronavirus pandemic following on from the 1920 Victorian bushfires. I think it's also important that we acknowledge the economic impacts on Victorians just haven't been distributed equally across the working population. The most severe impacts have been on women, young Victorians, workers in service industries and workers without post-school qualifications, with a significant overlap between these groups. Employment of women fell by 6.7% from the March to September quarters, while male employment fell by 3.9%. Young Victorians also experienced proportionately more job losses than older workers, with under 20 age category the most significantly affected. In total, the government has committed more than $13 billion since March to address the immediate impacts of COVID-19 on the health system, support businesses, and of course to protect jobs. So these impacts would be far worse without the record levels of support provided by the government, but it also, I think, demonstrates the significant recovery tasks that does lie ahead of us. At the heart of our economic recovery must be job creation. It's why this budget delivers a targeted set of initiatives that form the jobs plan. It's deliberately ambitious. It'll ensure an extra 200,000 Victorians are back in work by 2022 and 400,000 by 2025. So in guiding Victoria's recovery, the jobs plan pays to the state's strength, getting Victorians back to work and supporting every corner of our state. Supporting our workers is key to Victoria's successful economic and social recovery, as well as providing tax incentives to help businesses create jobs. So the government's making significant investment to boost workforce participation and support vulnerable workers. We're investing $1 billion in Victoria's TAFE and training sectors, which will include up to 80,000 new subsidised training and free TAFE places. We're going to provide a further $619 million for Jobs for Victoria, which will extend Jobs Victoria services and help Victorians into work, supporting at least 10,000 job placements. We're providing extensive tax relief, including $836 million in new jobs tax credits to encourage businesses to increase payrolls and to create jobs. And as we announced earlier this week, we're developing a secure work pilot scheme. It'll provide sick and carers leave at the national minimum wage for casual or insecure workers in priority industries, because Victorians shouldn't have to choose between going to work sick and putting food on the table. I think it's pretty clear from the material I've already taken you through that overwhelmingly women have been affected most during this pandemic. Through the jobs plan, the Andrews Labor government will support more women back into the workforce, ensuring that they have the stability and security that they deserve. Over $500 million will go towards building our recovery workforce across such vital areas of support in the community as mental health, family violence, health, child protection and education. We're going to put $170 million aimed at making kinder free next year. $82 million will expand before and after hours school care, making things easier for families. And of course, an essential part of our strategy to increase participation in the labour market. $150 million will support businesses to hire 6,000 women through wage subsidies. About 1/3 of the subsidies will go to older women, recognising the additional barriers that they are facing. $33 million will expand opportunities for apprentices and trainees through a flagship Big Build training pathways, with a particular focus once again on supporting more women into the construction sector. There'll be $6.3 million aimed to support, train and employ women building surveyors within local councils. And we're going to roll out a range of other initiatives to support women in specific industries where we know there's demand and growth: construction, tech and transport most notably. So I suppose this year's really reminded us just how important home really is. The budget will deliver a historic $5.3 billion big housing build to construct more than 12,000 new homes throughout metro and regional Victoria, as well as supporting around 10,000 jobs per year over the next 4 years to supercharge Victoria's economic recovery through the pandemic and beyond. So this package is aimed at boosting our state's social housing supply by 10% in just 4 years. It'll provide a stable foundation for thousands of Victorians to build their lives. Hundreds of new jobs will be created for women, Aboriginal Victorians, people with disabilities, social housing tenants, and people from diverse backgrounds through social procurement targets. It's a profound investment in a stronger, a fairer Victoria that recognises everyone deserves a place to call home. The Victorian Home Buyers Fund will provide $500 million to accelerate Victorians into home ownership. So the fund will contribute to the purchase price in exchange for a proportionate equity interest in the property. And this will reduce the size of the deposit required, which will help Victorians buy homes sooner. And we've also halved stamp duty that'll be owed on new properties and are providing a 25% discount on existing properties valued at up to $1 million, which are purchased between now and the 30th of June 2021. So a key part of our economic recovery is having a strong pipeline of infrastructure projects, delivering the jobs and the projects that our state needs. With a total of $134 billion of new and existing projects now funded and underway, our infrastructure program will support about 165,000 jobs. Earlier this year, we announced $2.7 billion worth of building works program for shovel-ready projects, which is already creating thousands of jobs across Victoria. This budget invests even more. We're updating schools, we're delivering a record social housing spend, and we're building critical transport infrastructure. And we are, of course, investing in transport and health, with all these projects being subject to our major projects skills guarantee. This will ensure 10% of all jobs go to apprentices, trainees and cadets. The budget makes a $9 billion investment into our healthcare system. It includes $2.8 billion to support our health services, including supporting delivery of our elective surgery delayed during the pandemic. And we'll build new hospitals and upgrade existing ones with a $2 billion investment that'll include the Warrnambool Base Hospital redevelopment. We've also ensured that our healthcare system was ready for the worst of COVID, commissioning new beds, new build, additional staff and innovative technology to deal with potential incoming demand. So we've built an extensive network of more than 200 testing sites across Victoria. Over $980 million is invested to purchase personal protective equipment and medical supplies. The purchase, this precious purchase will, of course, ensure that we've delivered through a centralised distribution model to those where the needs are most apparent, and is managed something like an order of 602 million gloves, 245 million masks, and 25 million gowns. So in 2019, the Andrews Labor government established the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system. We're providing nearly $870 million to ensure Victorians have the mental health support that they need as we get on with fixing a broken system. And that includes $605 million from a rollout of interim recommendations from the Royal Commission. It includes $492 million. We'll build about 120 acute mental health beds, and that's in addition to the 24 hospital in the home beds announced earlier this year, bringing the total to 144. 21 million will go towards suicide prevention to deliver the statewide expansion of hospital outreach, post-suicidal engagement services with individual, intensive and one-on-one support for Victorians as they rebuild their lives. And $19 million is being invested for 35 acute treatment beds for public health patients in private health services. So we know the cost of living is and will be for a major issue for many Victorians. So we're spending $448 million to help more Victorians improve the energy efficiency of their homes, reduce the cost of their power bills. $302 million will continue implementing our historic commitment to ensuring every child has access to 15 hours of 3-year-old kindergarten over the next decade, also providing a one-off $250 power saving bonus to eligible households. So we know that by using our budget to help household budgets, the strategy here is that to boost consumer confidence, to support our economy, to see more consumption going on in the economy, and of course to assist in social recovery. So the budget also invests in a number of key service areas. $2.3 billion will support Victorians with disabilities, including $1.6 billion investing in transforming support for students with a disability, doubling the number of students receiving extra support to 55,000. The budget will deliver $1.3 billion to protect and support children with their families, including reforming our care services. In Australia, an Australian First will ensure that every young person in out-of-home care can receive support up to the age of 21, making sure that they have the stable foundation to begin their lives. And we're also delivering $357 million to the biggest ever investment in support for our Aboriginal communities. It's a landmark investment in Aboriginal Victorians, led by Aboriginal Victorians. $238 million will enable the continued implementation of recommendations by the Royal Commission into family violence. So there's a lot to try and absorb there. I understand that, and I've tried to move through it as quickly as I can. Before I wrap up, I'd like to encourage everybody who has the capacity to do so to keep making use of Click for Vic, which continues to support hardworking local businesses, which you can visit, which are, of course, vital to so many local communities. So by clicking for Vic, Victorians will be connected to some online offerings from the Victorian Country Market, Providore, CoLab Pantry, and many more. And I'd also to encourage you, once again, my budget charity this year, the Victorian Bushfire Appeal. I know that we've all had many difficulties during the course of this year, but we can't forget the scourge of the bushfires that beset regional Victoria, particularly in the east of the state and the northeast of the state. So any assistance you can give would be greatly appreciated. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for that overview, Tim. We'll move straight into questions. We're keen to get through as many as we can. And of course, you can submit those questions by using the Slido box just under the video on the VCOS website, or by commenting on the Facebook feed, or replying on Twitter. And we'll have a look and try to get through as many of those as we can. We're getting a lot of feedback as well. A lot of it's positive, I've got to say, Treasurer. We've just been running a poll about how people rate the budget. The average is 4.2. So I guess my first question is, do you think you might be the first Treasurer in Australian history to deliver a budget that hasn't upset anybody?
Well, I'm not sure. 4.2, what's it out of? 10 or 5?
Out of 5.
So, oh, good. Yeah, well, that sounds reasonably good. Look, I know this will be a budget where Victorians have been doing it pretty hard, and we've had to devote an enormous amount of effort to our social services, not only in terms of our health and pandemic response, but also to recognise that there's been enormous adverse impacts upon our community services and upon our community more generally. So the fact that people have recognised the effort and the hard work, I really do appreciate, because our public servants are doing an exceptional job in very difficult circumstances. and our community services are as well. I suppose there will be those who will bang on about debt and deficit disaster, but I'll make the obvious point that having accumulated one of the best sub-sovereign credit ratings in the world, only about 10 jurisdictions have AAA credit rating, sub-sovereign, we're putting it to work, because if you've got credit, now's the time to do it, particularly given that borrowing is so cheap. And we're putting that to work for the Victorian people. And just to ensure that people understand how manageable that debt is, we're seeing our debt profile rise to about $155 billion over the forward estimates period. So over this budget in the next 3 years, what that'll mean is our servicing of debt as a percentage of our revenue will rise from about 3.4% to about 4.4%. And if people want to put it into a broader context, our debt for the entirety of the Victorian state government will be considerably less than the deficit this year that the federal government is running.
I guess to that point then, in your budget speech, you said that if this pandemic has been a stark reminder of anything, it's that people matter more than the bottom line. So I guess going to that, what are the government's goals then for social recovery for people, and how will you measure Victoria's social recovery?
Well, I suppose the first thing I'd say about how do we measure a social recovery is that we're getting people back into jobs. I'll be honest, there are many other manifestations that we, of course, will have to deal with, and they will be things like dealing with social disadvantage, being able to engage with problems at their inception rather than at the acute end of the presentation of those problems. So there are some things in this budget that I'm particularly passionate about, out-of-home care in particular, an Australian first, being able to make sure that young people get the support that they need. Paul McDermott, I think, came to see me about this some years ago, and I want to acknowledge the outstanding work that Minister Luke Dinellan has done in this space. But the idea that 18-year-olds without family support would be thrust into the community at large without any continuing support until the age 21, I think just is a prescription for further disadvantage and harm to befall them. And we all have a duty of care, so that's why I think those issues are important. I'm also proud of the $357 million that we're providing for Aboriginal Victorians to give them the autonomy, the authority to start to deal and lead with the issues in the way that they see most important, to deal with that torment of powerlessness that the Uluru Statement so rightly mentioned, and also to recognise that ultimately they have to be in charge of their destiny, and they have to be given the support as we move increasingly towards a process of engagement for treaty. Dealing with our mental health presentations, also vitally important. What I love is the other work that we're doing around education. So the out-of-hours school care that we'll be providing, which will provide much better opportunity for women to participate in the labour market, but also ensure that our kids get so much better access to the opportunity to deal with learning issues as they manifest through the years.
VCOS has been pushing for the government to adopt a well-being budgeting approach, similar to what New Zealand's done with a series of targets and measures to, I guess, measure community well-being. Do you think that would help track Victoria's social recovery in the post-COVID world?
I do. We've been looking at this. In fact, I thought we might have been able to bring some of this into land in this budget, but as you'd appreciate, this has been a very, very difficult budget to land. And I really do want to put a shout out to all the public servants who've done such an exceptional job in incredibly difficult times. It's one thing to sit around a boardroom table and compare spreadsheet numbers, but it's entirely a different one to work remotely and try and do it. So they've produced an incredibly good budget, a budget littered with enormous policy interventions, which the government's had to pull considerable levers to try and assist not only in economic recovery, but to deal with economic hardship and social needs. But yes, I see that we are going to have to do a lot more in terms of how do we account for an appropriate way of budgeting that ensures that we have long-term capacity to identify for Victorians what an appropriate investment in welfare looks like. If we don't come up with a system that does that, we'll ultimately be consigned to a situation where all we're doing is dealing with the sharp end and acute manifestations of problems rather than making the necessary investments early in avoiding those problems. And that's what wellbeing budgeting's all about. New Zealand have been a trendsetter in this area. It's been getting a bit of attention overseas. It doesn't mean that you can avoid your acute presentations, but it does mean that the old adage of a stitch in time saves 9. If we can account for the savings that we make over the long term, I think it makes a lot of sense in an accounting world that we get bean counters such as me starting to think of those long-term social benefits by appropriate investment in a timely way.
So why has it taken a pandemic to fund social programs in a way that experts have been calling for decades?
Well, I think we've been doing a lot already, Andrew. Yes, I think it's true to say that we've accelerated our thinking. So, for example, the government has already given a commitment that we'll be moving towards 3-year-old kindergarten, but we've accelerated our thinking and our plans around that. We've also indicated that the things that we can do for the community, for example, the provision of a number of services have had to be accelerated because the need is so much more apparent. But it's not just about the social support that we're giving. We have to get people back into jobs. So we're holding ourselves to account by setting a target for ourselves, 200,000 jobs by the end of 2022 and 400,000 jobs by the end of 2025. We're doing that because the interventions that we make, we know will ultimately work in the community's best interests if we recognise that you repair your economy best by repairing some of the most adverse social manifestations of a recession. And the most telling of those is unemployment. The longer people are in unemployment, the longer we consign them to disadvantage. And that's why the government is moving as quick as we can to make these investments. Some may say, why are we giving tax breaks to business? It's because business have done it hard. And whilst the government may constitute 1/6, 1/7 of the economy, the vast weight of employment is being managed by the private sector. They've done it tough too, and we're going to give them tax breaks to assist in doing that, provided they employ. So, of course, our payroll tax credit system is all about rewarding employers that take on more people. Now, I know these are probably maybe not the front of mind things when talking at a forum such as this, but to avoid the manifestations of social harm, we have to get people back into work as quickly as we can.
You've got a lot of cash going out the door at the moment, but and you've referenced the debt that comes with that. So, is there going to be a reckoning in a few years' time when stimulus isn't needed so much? Are we going to see belt tightening and some of those social programs cut to try to rein in spending?
Well, I'll make 2 points, Andrew, on that. You can't cut yourself out of a recession. And if you try, you only make things worse. You exacerbate the situation, both from an economic point of view and a social harm point of view. It's a bit like trying to dig a hole to elevate your line of sight and your aspiration, and we're not going to do it. Our strategy is pretty simple about how we deal with the economic circumstances that confront us. Firstly, we need to build an economic recovery. And all of these interventions, some $49 billion worth of spending, is about making sure that we get Victorians back into work, and that we assist Victorian businesses to be able to employ. So first, deal with the manifestations of the problem, the recession we're encountering, and grow the economy. Secondly, to therefore make sure that we move to a cash operating surplus in the medium term. Thirdly, to move to an operating surplus. And then fourthly and finally, be able to put ourselves in a position where we can stabilise our debt liabilities moving forward. You can't jump that sequence. It has to be done in that manner, and none of it requires us to have wholesale cuts to the way that outlays apply. Now, that doesn't mean that the government won't always aspire to deliver services in as efficient a way as possible, but I can tell you this government is not in the business of exacerbating social harm by cutting at what would be the worst possible time.
Question for you from Rachel. You've funded multi-year programs across the social sector, yet community service sector contracts are still short-term year by year. How is that sustainable or desirable?
Well, we've put a little bit of money aside, I think some $15 million, to assist community service providers to have some greater certainty about the longevity of the provision of services. I know this has been an issue that's beset many of our vital community service providers, and hopefully those sort of contributions will assist them with the certainty of employment going forward. We've also sought to ensure that those projects that really go to ensure that the community's needs in the provision of social services are in the short term not kept on that 1 year fall off a cliff process. So we have increased our expenditure and the profile over the longer term to ensure that they go on over the forward estimates, so they don't fall off the cliff at the end of 1 year. And we've done that because we recognise that the effect of the social harm that we're confronting will be with us for some time to come.
Another one for you. The Big Build housing focus has been on community housing, not public housing. Why is that?
Well, it's a mixture of both, I would say. At $5.3 billion, we accept that there'll be both public and social housing involved. And we take the view that if we can manage the mix of public and social housing best, then we'll get the best bang for our buck, as it were. We'll be able to leverage more activity and provide at least the 12,000 household units that we're looking for. We're also, Andrew, one of the things that I'm quite proud of is the extra $600 million that we've identified for the provision of, firstly, $500 million for our home buyers fund, which is about making sure that we get more people into their own homes. So it's providing for accessibility and affordability of housing. There's $100 million that have really been put aside to assist councils deal with fast tracking approval. So we take a lot of the red tape out of the provision of land and housing stock into the marketplace. It's all about recognising that we've got to do more than just one thing here. It's about public, it's about social housing, it's about using all the levers at our disposal in order to ensure that we can get Victorians back into their homes. I'm particularly fond of the build to rent initiatives that we've put in place here, Andrew, which is aimed really at making sure that we can get Victorians into whatever form of home they see as most desirable for their circumstances. And I know that the construction industry is very excited about the prospect of moving to a variety of models that will assist us in that objective.
A question from Sky. The TAFE boost is welcomed, but those of us around after the GFC saw the negative consequences for vulnerable people used as fodder for training providers signed into training for careers they were not suited to. What will prevent this in 2021?
A number of things. Of course, we're massively expanding the free TAFE services and the courses that will be on offer. All up, we're expecting to see as I say, about $1 billion being spent in this area. But importantly, what we expect to find as part of those contributions is that the state will be a very substantial, in fact, the vast majority provider of services through our TAFE institutions. And look, I know there'll be some criticism of that from those who are staunch advocates of competitive neutrality, but I've got to say we've got to get people into those courses that we have confidence fit the profile of need in the community, help us be able to deliver our big build initiatives, and also the enormous requirements that we're going to have in our social welfare areas going forward, whether it be in our kindergartens or alternatively recognising that increasingly we're going to need more teachers in our schools as a consequence of as we move progressively to meet our Gonski obligations going forward. So it's going to be increasingly, I think, a much greater focus around the public provision of these services, and we will continue to have an engagement with private providers where there's an obvious need to do it. But increasingly the state sees a role for itself, both in terms of quality assurance, but also the provision of these training services so that we don't have some of the more perverse behaviours that we saw historically when national training guarantees and other such schemes were put in place and, quite frankly, were very poorly constructed and managed by the private sector. And we want to make sure that we utilise this money as quickly, efficiently as possible in the areas of need and the skill areas of most evident need as well.
Nina from Vic SRC is asking, in regards to the 71,000 mobile devices that students will be able to keep, who will be responsible for the maintenance and insurance of those devices? Will this be an annual funded area so that no student misses out in the future, or is it a one-off?
Well, that's a matter we're still working through at the moment, Andrew, but I suppose the obvious point is that the maintenance and the management of these things, firstly, I think will have to be managed at a school level. But what that liability means for school budgets, I think we'll have to work through in the context of the next budget, which isn't so far away, I've got to say, with a fair degree of trepidation, only about 6 months. And I'm sure that the Deputy Premier and the Minister for Education will be a very strong advocate about how we actually ensure that the asset that we've provided to all those young people who've had a pretty hard time of it is effectively maintained. Otherwise, it's a false economy in practical terms.
Daniel's asking, there was talk of adding people who've been in the out-of-home care system to the priority jobs list for social procurement targets alongside others who've experienced significant disadvantage. Can they access these opportunities yet?
As I know there is a provision for disadvantage. I just can't at the moment give you certainty that it includes out-of-home care. I'll have to get back to you specifically in the questionnaire with an answer on that, but it does expressly look at people from disadvantaged backgrounds. So I imagine it will be, and if it's not, we'll certainly be looking at that further going forward. It makes a lot of sense, quite frankly. We are utilising our capital spend and our procurement spend to make sure not only that we get people trained into the areas of need in the community going forward, to get the skills that we need to deliver the services and the capital infrastructure that are so important to us. But also, I think the key here is to recognise that we can't, in any sensible way, have a responsibly exercise the duty of care if we don't assist people coming out of home care into effective economic participation in the labour market. So that will certainly be an area that we will give attention to if we haven't already incorporated it quite expressly in our procurement strategies. As you'd appreciate, women, people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and of course people from lower socio-economic areas, including of course Aboriginal Victorians, are already expressly identified in our procurement strategies, and we'll have more to say about those as we roll out individual procurement strategies. We've got a lot of capacity to leverage that. We're investing $19.6 billion this year, and for the 3 years of the forward estimates on average each and every year. So that's quadruple what the 10-year average was in capital spend before we came to government, and that gives us a lot of opportunity to address a lot of disadvantage and harm in the labour market. And it also demonstrates that we're going to have an enormous capacity constraint that we're going to have to deal with as a community and as a government in order to get a lot of this work away.
Maxine Burton from Deaf Victoria is asking about the government's responsibility to engage with diverse groups with different communication needs. She says for deaf people and other culturally and linguistically diverse groups through COVID, this was highlighted and there were interpreters used, but it's now stopped. Is there money in the budget to keep that program going?
I'm sorry, Andrew, I couldn't go to that level of detail, but I do know that the Premier has made it very clear that he recognises and supports the work that our Auslan interpreters do and the vital role that they played during, of course, the pandemic crisis in keeping all Victorians, particularly the hearing impaired, across and understanding exactly the nature of the problems that we confronted. We've certainly put extra funding into funding for our multicultural and linguistic services as part of this budget, largely because we do recognise that you can't really get unified community support unless you talk to people in the languages that make them feel, that they have greatest capacity to appreciate the nature of the problem that's in their mother tongues. But more importantly, I think that would equally apply to Auslan. So we'll go back and have a look at that and see what more information we can give.
You've waded into a few federal fights in this budget, and a questioner here asking, is it possible to seriously address disadvantage without raising the permanent rate of Newstart? And where do you think that rate should land? Care to comment?
Oh, well, look, no, it's not, to answer it directly. And we've been pretty clear that Newstart historically was far from adequate. We were very, very pleased with the federal government's job seeker arrangements, a little less excited about the winding back of job seeker payments. I think the point we've said consistently to the federal government is we do urge them to think about what constitutes an adequate level of payment in an ongoing sense for job seeker or Newstart payments. Certainly from our perspective, they're too low, and the job seeker experience has demonstrated that those contributions have to be raised. Any further erosion in those payments would be a matter of concern for us, but we do understand that the Commonwealth do have budgetary issues just as ourselves. It's a question of having a broader engagement.
Oh, we might be having a few issues with the Treasurer's feed there. We'll see what's going on, see if our tech gurus can work out what's happening. See if we can get a word from somebody. Might just have to ask the Treasurer's office to reconnect if they can. The joys of technology, something we've all become very used to during the last 9 months, but we haven't managed to iron out all the gremlins just yet. We're still adjusting to this new way of doing things. Everybody's trying to work out what to do. Cross our fingers we can get onto this quickly. While we're waiting, just a reminder to keep submitting your questions. There've been some really good ones so far. You can do that on the Slido bar just under the video on the VCOS website, or reply to the Twitter stream, or leave a comment on Facebook there as well. We've got Emma King, the VCOS CEO. While we're waiting for the Treasurer, Emma, do you just want to talk us through what you saw as being some of the, the hits in this budget?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Andrew. Can I say a huge thank you to you for stepping in today as well to MC today's event. It's fantastic to have you with us. I know I'll jump off when the Treasurer steps back in, but I think one of the fantastic things about the budget this year was there was actually so many highlights. And I think a real recognition that the social and economic, when it comes to the recovery, are inextricable, but actually they're inextricable all of the time. But I think the pandemic has flushed that out like never before. One of our challenges on budget day was actually there were so many big ticket items. So, for example, looking at the significant investment in social housing was profound. Looking at free kinder, looking at the energy investments that haven't perhaps had quite as much publicity, but they're actually pretty phenomenal. And one of the things that's really important about them is that they link beautifully with the social housing announcement. So not only do they go to providing low-income people with, one-off $250 payment, they go to some of the long-term pieces as well, such as making homes, drought-proof and providing, better energy appliances, etc., at low or no cost for people as well. So they're pretty phenomenal. Some of the other highlights, we sort of had a bit of a shopping list almost, I think, in terms of looking at what was announced on the day, but looking at the money, for example, for disability, for students in school for disability. This is money we've advocated for pretty much forever in terms of taking a strengths-based approach, but also expanding the scheme so that more children and young people in our schools are eligible as well. So that's a definite highlight. Obviously, money around training, money for the Home Stretch campaign, and a shout out to all involved in that was pretty phenomenal as well. Mental health, really, in a way, the list goes on. One of the challenges we have is that there's also some really good money in there. For example, looking at items like libraries and parks, and the Treasurer touched on the money for multicultural communities as well. They're really significant outcomes as well, Andrew. So a bit of a very broad overview, but things I think that really need to be acknowledged.
I understand the Treasurer's office is still giving his computer a bit of a technical tap. So what did you make of the Treasurer's comments there about a shift towards a wellbeing budget? Obviously something you guys have been keen for, but he seemed to indicate that that's something the government is seriously pursuing.
I think that's really exciting, and it's we've advocated very strongly in our budget submission for a wellbeing budget in terms of saying, and the Treasurer touched on in his speech on the day, in terms of saying, budgets are about more than the bottom line, but I think it's about holding spending accountable to make sure that you can have a AAA credit rating, but if you've got 100,000 people waiting on a list for public housing, what does that actually mean? And we want every single part of government to actually account for the well-being of Victorian people and the well-being for the Victorian economy. And we know that when we look at it's not only New Zealand, it's Scotland, it's Iceland, and others that really talk about actually how do we put people first. So when this budget came out, I saw it very much as a significant shift in that direction. And it's very exciting, to be frank, to hear the Treasurer talk about that as the way forward, and hopefully promising as we head in towards the May budget as well, because I'm very mindful that not only have we just actually had a pretty fantastic budget, the best budget that I've certainly ever been in a lockup for and been around for, but also when we're looking towards the May budget as well and looking at that shift around putting people first, and not to suggest it wasn't happening before, but it's interesting, as you said in your opening remarks, there's nothing like a crisis to actually bring out what's important, and it's certainly magnified issues around inequality and poverty within our community, and a real call for action to address those.
And is the New Zealand model one that you'd want to adopt, or is there sort of a different way that you think our success rate could or should be measured?
Look, the New Zealand model is a really great starting point. I think there's a group of wellbeing economies now, and I think one of the opportunities that Victoria has is that we've seen Victoria really leapfrog other states and territories, actually for a while, in my opinion, but particularly in terms of looking at areas such as that investment into social housing, whereas others have stepped back or just played, which has been the case here actually under successive governments. I think there's a chance for Victoria to really step in and lead the way when it comes to wellbeing budgets. There's looking at, for example, Scotland, Iceland, New Zealand. I think we are undertaking some work around an analysis of what works well in each of those economies and then saying actually what makes the most sense to bring back to Victoria. So we're pretty keen to have those conversations with obviously the Treasurer and the Premier and, basically everyone involved in the Andrews government and really involve the broader community sector in those discussions, because I think it's a really exciting way forward. It's a way to look at how do we deliver for the people of Victoria. Because, for example, if you're delivering on a transport budget, you can talk about, well, we're delivering X number of new trains or trams, etc. But actually, how does that make a difference in people's lives? If, for example, I have a disability and I want to get on my bus or my train or my tram at point A, but I need to actually be able to navigate a number of different transport points or just access in the first place to get to point B, then actually that's how the government should be accounting for their spend as well. It's not just about the infrastructure buy, it's actually about what does it mean for people and how can people use it and what's the value to every Victorian and every Victorian community.
And I guess if you're benchmarking, it reduces the likelihood of going from a feast to a famine when the belt tightening eventually comes around. Tim hinted at the prospect of longer term contracts for the social sector. What sort of difference would that make for people on the ground?
A phenomenal difference. And I suspect everyone listening would have been hanging on to every aspect of the Treasurer's answer to that question. I'm mindful that we've just had a phenomenal budget and we wanted to call that out for what it was, but this is unfinished business in terms of looking at, and I think the huge value of community sector organisations and particularly a number of the grassroots organisations as well that provided enormous assistance throughout the pandemic. We have never seen the value of community sector organisations more highly than during the pandemic. It was always there, but I don't think it was as visible. And we know that they are the glue that holds our communities together. We know the demand on community sector organisations is greater than it has ever been, and it's always been great. And we know that we need funding security. So we need funding security so that we can ensure that all organisations can genuinely provide for their community, but also for workforce security. And I absolutely welcome the government's commitment to the 5 days leave for people who are casuals, because our workforce is becoming so much more casualised and more precarious in nature. We've got to be really mindful that the contracts that are set up don't actually set the grounds for that actually happening in the first place. And when you're getting contracts that are like 3-month rollover contracts, that doesn't bring stability for anyone. It doesn't bring stability for workers. It doesn't bring stability for organisations. And it certainly doesn't bring stability for the people in our community that need those services. So I think there's real room to move here, and I'm sure we'll explore this further when we talk with David Hayward and Danielle Wood as well later. But there's enormous economic value from investing in the care sector as well, and we've seen some really huge and significant steps forward, but lots to go, I think, in terms of how we provide funding security for the organisations that we actually rely on the most.
Fantastic. I'm told we might have the Treasurer back. There he is.
You do indeed, Andrew. I've had the entire resources of the Victorian Government IT section working on joining you again. I apologise for that.
We might need to add a line item for a new computer and a better internet plan, I think, for you, but we'll keep going. Thank you for coming back. Christina Laris, the CEO of Women's Health East, is asking, while it's great to see a gender lens on the budget, only about 5% of women's jobs lost during the pandemic are actually addressed. Investment in women's jobs needed across multiple budget cycles. So what will you do to lead that sustained gender work?
Well, I think one of the obvious things about this budget is that we have recognised that there is a lot more to do. The first point I'd make is the investments that we're putting in teacher tutors, about 4,100 extra jobs. About 80% of those will be female jobs, almost certainly. The work that we're doing around child protection and mental health, we know that they are predominantly female professions in the sense that they have a lot more women in those professions. The other broader thing that we have to do is to assist women back into the workforce by recognising that there are obvious areas of disadvantage where the state will need to assist and subsidise businesses in taking on women workers, particularly women over 45, because we know that there is a very profound problem in getting women of that age back into the workforce. So $150 million of that funding is going to go towards getting women back into the workforce, around 10,000 jobs. We know, of course, that we're going to have to assist women to train and to recover out of that $631 million that we put aside for free TAFE, subsidised training places. We put aside $155 million to provide access to the most impacted essentially by the pandemic, with a focus on getting more women back in the workforce. So it's a multi-pronged approach. Firstly, to recognise that we have a problem here, and to deal with the capacity to get women back into work by facilitating the provision of support in those areas of the workforce where women are most likely to participate. Secondly, to assist in using our procurement strategies and our broader capacity to subsidise businesses by bringing women into the labour market. And finally, to recognise that there are some industries where women don't predominate so much, but they should be given a much better shot at employment opportunities. And it's construction industry, it's tech areas, it's transport. So we've identified those three industries as industries where we'll actively promote a strategy to create careers for women in those particular industries, because they are so poorly represented in those workforces. Of course, apprenticeships are the keys to a great career, and we've put aside $5 million for leading TAFE's training and industry organisations to offer programs to get more women doing the trades that they love. So recognising that this is a multi-pronged approach, we're going to have to work on it further. And this won't be a one budget exercise, Andrew. It's going to require a lot more attention to detail. Women have been very substantially and very adversely affected by this event. Young people too, people with relatively limited skills are also bearing the brunt of this economic event. Those will be the areas of continuing focus. This is not, to coin a phrase, this is not one shot in the locker. This is going to require diligent and consistent effort going forward.
I think we've got time for one last quick one just before you have to go. Do you think the 2021-22 budget's going to be as generous as this one was?
It's hard to imagine that it could be. Can I put it as frankly as that? There is no doubt that we're going to have to continue the support and assistance in the recovery process. I think I'd like to wait a little bit longer to just see how this economic event settles in. You'll see in this budget that the Auditor General has made some comments that he's a little bit concerned about the qualifications around the economy and the forecast for the economy, because he, like all of Treasury and myself included, don't know exactly how this economic event will play out. And some of the things are ultimately beyond our control, such as how quickly we get a broadly available vaccine into the community. It'll also deal with, well, how much confidence can we inspire in the community in advance of that broadly available vaccine. And as you can see, this is a very big investment in confidence. And the one message, I suppose, for this sector, but for the community at large, we'd like to leave you with is we're going to be with the community every step of the way in the repair of the economy and in an honest and frank assessment of the challenges that the community confront, particularly those most adversely affected by it. We've got a long way to go, but this is a very good start. We need to work cooperatively with business. We need to work cooperatively with the community sector to get this job done. This is a good start, but it won't be the end of the work we have to do.
Tim Pallas, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much to everybody as well for your questions. I'd like to just ask Emma King, VCOS CEO, back to give a vote of thanks and some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Treasurer, thank you so much for your generosity and your time in being here today. I know that you are incredibly busy. You always make time for VCOS and the community sector post-budget to spend time with us to talk through the things that matter most to the community sector. And I would just like to say how much we appreciate that. I would also like to offer my very sincere congratulations to you, the Premier and the Andrews government on what is a phenomenal budget, and how nice it is to be able to actually say that. We were in lockup and just, I think, to be candid, thrilled and emotional actually, in terms of looking at a number of the issues that people have advocated around for years, well before my time, and social housing is a true example of that. Just to think we're actually seeing some extraordinary progress, and when we see that, it's really important to congratulate and call it out. So I really, my most profound thanks in terms of that as well. We so much enjoy working with you and your office as well. So can I give a shout out to your team, because I know organising these events virtually and during changing times and restrictions is always a challenge. So I would really like to pay my significant thanks to your team. I think we know and we truly understand that this, the recovery, in terms of the recovery, the economic and the social are just inextricably interlinked. We're really looking forward to working with you, I guess, as we now move towards implementation, but also, as you said, the next budget, because in a way it's just around the corner. And hearing your comments around wellbeing and a potential wellbeing budget are really exciting. I felt pretty thrilled as well when you stepped up on budget day and made the comments around, well, there is no better time to tackle justice and inequality, and people matter more than the bottom line. And I think we know that, as I mentioned earlier, that you can have a AAA credit rating, but if you've got hundreds of thousands of people that don't have a home, you've got to be able to balance those two things together. And we need both the economic and the social. And I think this budget really delivers on that. And I just want to say my most sincere thanks. Congratulations. We're really looking forward to working with you on the next stages. And thank you again for being here with us today.
My great pleasure, Emma, and it's always been a great pleasure to work with VCOS. And I'll pass on your regards to my staff. They make me look good, or at least they try very hard. So it's been a great pleasure, and I'm looking forward to continuing the work together going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Emma, stick with us. We'll digest the budget now, have a look at what Tim said there, perhaps what he didn't say as well. And to do that, we'll bring in a couple of other experts, the CEO of Australia's leading public policy think tank, the Grattan Institute, Danielle Wood, welcome, and also RMIT economist and seasoned budget analyst, Professor David Hayward. Thank you all for being here. We'll start with Danielle. Just give us your thoughts, I guess, on the budget and perhaps Tim's comments in the past hour.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Emma and VCOS for having me. So look, I was watching the poll as it was playing out, and, I think probably the 4.2 rating kind of struck me as about right. I think, we have seen the Victorian government really step up and address the economic circumstances at hand. It's clearly a big budget, and as Emma said, bigger than I think any of us have seen before. 25 billion of stimulus measures over 3 years. It's the biggest by some margin of any of the other states and territories that have handed down a budget so far. And we need to remember, of course, this also comes on top of quite a large Commonwealth government stimulus program of 74 billion. So, I think we are entering that recovery phase of the crisis. Fingers crossed we can keep the health situation under control, because that is pivotal to the recovery. But I think it's really great that we've seen both Commonwealth and state government recognise that we do need significant stimulus at this point and come to the party. They have made quite different choices around what that stimulus looks like. And I was saying to Emma yesterday, I sort of call this the shadow budget of the Commonwealth. But another way of thinking of it is kind of like one of those Escher paintings, where you've almost got a bit of a mirror in terms of the measures. So, big spending on social housing that I know VCOS and many others are really excited about, and rightly so. As a community, it's something we desperately need. but also it's really good stimulus. Very labour intensive. It creates jobs that in the area that we know is going to take a hit, the housing construction sector. So it's pretty no-brainer as a stimulus program, and a lot of us were surprised that the Commonwealth wasn't willing to go there. The second way it's really different is in terms of the focus on job creation in government services, and so things like the tutoring program to help disadvantaged students catch up on lost learning, mental health, child protection jobs. And I really think that sort of signals a bit of a change in mindset we need, that, stimulus doesn't have to just be about construction. We need to find ways to ramp up spending on, care and services job as economies take a hit. The third, which is interrelated, was the very clear emphasis on women, and we heard the Treasurer address that there, very much part of the language of the budget, but also a number of measures that go directly to that point. And I, want to particularly call out the free kinder, the expansion of the free kinder program and the after school hours care. I think, really we're going to face a challenge on the other side of this around women's workforce participation, and anything that makes that sort of care cheaper and more accessible is going to be really important. And finally, the direct industry supports, also quite distinct from the Commonwealth budget. They went, both budgets go hard on construction, but Commonwealth really went on utilities, manufacturing. Here we see a lot more spending on things like tourism and the arts. And, I do think that makes a lot of sense given the nature of the hit, and given that those sectors were really at the economic front line of this crisis. So I do think, the politics is interesting. It did look almost as if they were kind of going at the areas where the Commonwealth had some blind spots, but, I'm kind of not inclined to criticise, because I think, good politics was good policy here. None of this to say the budget is perfect, and there's certainly things we've been critical around. The stamp duty concessions I don't think make a lot of sense. Some of the spending on large-scale transport projects, without good business cases, I'm certainly not supportive of. But my overall comment would really be, I think this is the right budget for this recession, and, hopeful that along with the Commonwealth efforts and the other side of that Escher painting, we will be on the path to recovery now.
David, what's your take?
I think it's a terrific budget, and congratulate the Treasurer. Look, what I thought was, how the heck did they manage to put this together so quickly? It's a great credit to the Victorian Public Service and the Treasury and the Treasurer that they were able to do this. But taking a more helicopter view, I just get the impression we're going through a major change in fashion, and the old neoliberalism, the hard-edged neoliberalism, has gone, and it's beginning to be replaced by something new. Exactly what that is, not clear yet, but I can tell you Victoria is right at the forefront globally of charting new waters, and I'm immensely proud to see the state taking that role. And remember, it's on the back of that wonderful way Victorians responded to the second wave of the coronavirus outbreak, the lockdown. I think we're sort of seeing Victorians sort of stand up in a way I haven't seen before, and I just get the impression it's quite special. The challenge going forward is to see how the government manoeuvres this new space they've created. Previously, when governments have taken on a lot of debt like this, some of the conservative institutions in Victoria have really hit them hard. That hasn't happened so far. I think everybody's trying to work out where we're going, but gee, what a great spot to be in, and congratulations to VCOST for playing a role in it. I really look forward to that wellbeing budget next year, because that's going to be the next step.
Emma, we obviously got some of your initial thoughts before. Was there anything that wasn't in the budget, aside from some wellbeing measures, that you would have liked to see? I mean, I know you got a lot of what you wanted, but anything else you would have liked that, you might be hoping for in May?
Look, I think the thing is that I touched on earlier in terms of the unfinished business around contracts for community sector organisations. I think that's a big piece that's actually really important. And also, which I think was picked up in the budget to some degree, but we've seen that significant investment in infrastructure, but also some spends in absolutely the right place, can I just call out? So social housing, an absolute winner. I think it's always looking at that spend in the care economy. So what I'm looking for, and I know not everyone loves that term care economy, so I totally flag that up front, but I think there's some more detail that we've yet to see in terms of the jobs announcements. There's so much in those packages. So actually taking, having the space to kind of do the ongoing analysis that we're undertaking right now around exactly what does that mean, unpicking the detail, the implementation is going to be key. So I do think the next parts now really go to implementation, plus there's a longer term piece here about that investment in the care economy and some more security of work. So taking away that real precariousness which exists at the moment. Some levers are within the state government's control, others are within the federal government's control, but that's got to be a priority, I think, in terms of looking at contracts more generally.
So, David, I might ask you to pick up on that, just on the issue of short-term contracts and casual contracts. Given the one-year type funding arrangements that the government has, how can they go about fixing that type of insecure work?
They can just choose to fix it. I think the reason why I get the problem with the care economy as a couple of words, but the reason why I like it is that most people get it, they understand it, and what we're trying to do is change the narrative. So instead of people thinking that what we do is about welfare and consumption, they start talking about it as investment. And once you start thinking in those terms, you start changing the conditions under which the services are delivered. So it's a really important point. And you might have noticed today that when the Treasurer was talking, he did talk about we have invested in education, we have invested in social housing. It wasn't about consumption, that was investment. And I think that's a really important process for us to go. So it's a policy choice, but the stronger we make the case that there's a productivity dividend behind this, the more likely it is that we're going to achieve that victory.
And how do you ensure that that continues in future budgets and with future governments?
Oh, that's the challenge. That's what I said. I think we're at a really interesting pivot point right now as the government charts a new course. I think there's kind of like a rethink globally around what role of public debt in the public sector and governments being there to balance the economy, not to balance the books. All of this is part of an integrated set of packages, a whole new way of thinking. And we've just got to keep having our voices heard. But the more that we can put together a narrative that makes sense to most people, the more likely it is that we'll be successful.
Danielle, I'll just take you back to the point you made before about the difference between the state budget and the federal budget. Do you feel do they work together?
I think they do work together, and that's definitely a positive. So we were certainly critical about a number of the omissions that I touched on around the federal budget, particularly kind of lack of investment in the services sector, direct services jobs, jobs for women, social housing. They were all kind of things that I think we're standing out as omissions. But when you add in the Victorian government measures and particularly how big they went on some of those things, so I don't think any of us were kind of expecting the scale of that social housing package. I think they actually do now work together quite nicely. Of course, being economists, we will start to look forward, and I think there are still a couple of quite sizable emissions on the Commonwealth side, which the state government can't step up to. So we had that question about Newstart. That pretty clearly is one of them to me. That when there needs to be a decision on that permanent rate of Newstart, it's going to be incredibly important. And the second, I think is, well, no, I've got three actually. Aged care is another one. And I think they were fair not to move in the last budget because they've been waiting on the findings of the Royal Commission. They will be coming out in February. So I would really hope we're going to see, some very significant shake-up to that sector in the Commonwealth May budget. We were all being pretty devastated at some of the things coming out of that. And thirdly, childcare and childcare affordability is something where I'd like to see some serious movement from the Commonwealth. Victorian government has done something through the Kinder program, but ultimately the big lever there sits with the Commonwealth government. And if we are going to ensure that we get women back in work, that's going to be a really important policy lever for them to pull.
Question for you from one of our viewers. Has the Grattan Institute done any work on the impact of this budget on household budgets?
No, we haven't done any sort of direct modelling of that. Clearly there's going to be a number of channels through which that plays in. So, direct job creation obviously is very much a positive for household budgets. Some households will benefit from other measures like the stamp duty discounts. So no is the bottom line, is we don't have kind of firm numbers on that. But, whenever the government is pumping in this much money to the economy, it is going to be a positive for household budgets. And, that's clearly what the Treasurer is talking about when he's talking about kind of boosting that confidence. And that's going to be incredibly important. It's not just the money they're putting in, it's what it does for the mindset of both consumers and businesses. They're going to really matter for how this budget takes and how it pushes us along that recovery curve.
Question for all of you from Sally Womsey. How do we cure the government of its addiction to hard hats? Roads and tunnels aren't always the answer, but governments love them because they look good. David, I might ask you first. What do you think?
Wouldn't that be nice to see premiers and prime ministers in aged care homes and childcare centres and other care economy settings rather than choose the hard hats? I think there's a little bit of a way to go, but I think that there's a point underpinning that too, which is that, look, right now we haven't got any population growth, and the economy is dependent upon population growth for growth for the last 20 years. Well, if we don't have the population growth, maybe we don't need all that infrastructure. And if we don't have the infrastructure, where's the money going to be spent? Just remember that you get a much bigger employment return if you invest in the care economy than you do if you invest in infrastructure. I think that some of those signature projects like the Suburban Rail Loop, it might be 6,000 jobs. You put the equivalent money into the care economy and you'll get 10 or 15 times as many. So I think it's a bit of a way to go. But look, today, as I said, the Treasurer was talking about our sort of work as investment, and maybe you never know what will happen next year.
Emma, do you have a view? Do you think you need to give him some high vis?
I know, I feel like we need to find our high-vis alternative, but the other part is that is a no-brainer, is we know that the care economy is the fastest growing part of the economy. Those jobs can't be automated, they can't be replaced by robots, they need people. As David mentioned, the return to the economy is phenomenal. And the other part is, when we look, going back to that sort of wellbeing measure as well, I know, for example, the points that Daniella's made around getting women back to work and looking at, early childhood education, etc., the importance of that. The other thing that I would say is when we know that a high quality early childhood education changes a child's life. The reality is if a kid is behind when they start school, basically they don't catch up unless there's significant intervention. So if we really want to invest in our future and invest in future wellbeing, that not only goes to education, which is vitally important, but health and economic outcomes, the evidence is irrefutable. You invest in kids, you invest in them early, and it makes an extraordinary difference to their life trajectory and an extraordinary difference to, therefore, the Victorian community.
And Danielle, how do you fix the political addiction to cutting ribbons?
Yeah, look, it is a great question. I entirely agree with the points that both David and Emma have made there. The economics is pretty clear cut on this. You actually create more jobs per dollar spent. Those jobs are labour intensive. Second of all, they're long-term jobs. They're not going away. And third of all, you're delivering, a real investment in long-term social value. So the case is pretty clear cut. I think we all need to keep making it. I think the Commonwealth Government did pay a political price for being a bit blind to this in its budget, and you certainly heard those criticisms, I think, bubbling up in ways that we haven't before. So I think the community conversation is starting to recognise this and change, but we just need to keep reinforcing the point. These are real jobs, these are good jobs, they're not lesser jobs. Maybe it is you need some kind of photo op equivalent, I'm not sure. I certainly went and had a look through the Prime Minister's photo ops in the lead up to the budget and post, and almost all of them did involve a hard hat or high vis. So somehow we need to make these pictures seem compelling to them as well, I think. But I think the more we talk about it, the more we explain why this matters, the more we put human faces on these jobs and why they're important, I think we will sort of start to see that political dialogues shift.
One of the criticisms that the opposition has levelled at this budget is that the Treasurer might have missed an opportunity for tax reform. New South Wales and the ACT have started transitioning away from stamp duty towards land tax. David, I might ask you, do you think that's something that Victoria should be considering?
Yeah, I'm sure they've been thinking about it for a while, Andrew, but I just think that they put it down the priority list, and I would have done exactly the same thing. There's some tax cuts in this budget, but look, the tax base was really destroyed in a way by the coronavirus and the impact that it had on GST revenues. Probably not a good time to be giving taxes away when you're struggling to just bring in the money that you thought you were going to get. It's understandable that the opposition would be talking about that. I'm waiting to see them say a little bit more about the debt issue, because that's been their traditional way of responding to budgets like this. See if they can politicise and generate concerns around the level of debt, and let's see if we can't mount a proper defence this time compared to previous times. Interest rates are very low. There is nothing wrong with the government's borrowing. In fact, it makes absolute sense right now. But I think that's the big issue waiting to be addressed. Is it just hasn't quite properly come to the surface. If I was the opposition leader, I'd probably be going harder on that and less on the tax equation right now.
I think Louise Staley is actually on her feet delivering the budget reply as we speak. So we might see in the next few minutes exactly what they're proposing there. Danielle, do you have a view on tax reform? Was it a missed opportunity, do you think?
Look, I think it's not a bad time to do it. And I think New South Wales, to be fair, had spent a lot of time pre-coronavirus kind of tilling the soil on the land tax stamp duty swap. So they'd run a New South Wales Federal Financial Review that had recommended the swap. They'd been doing some policy work in the background around it. So they were much better placed, I think, to roll it out now. The reason I say it's not a bad time is, in a world where your budget is taking a big hit anyway, perhaps that kind of lost revenue, and they will lose revenue for a substantial period of time under the model they've proposed, just doesn't seem as damaging in the context of really big budget deficits anyway. So I think what they've done is a good long-term reform. I would like to see Victoria go down a similar path, perhaps with a kind of less damaging, designing it in a way that it's kind of less damaging to revenue over time. But I'm not critical of them for not doing it in this budget. I think they had a lot on their plate. There was a lot going on. It might be a different question as we move into next year and beyond.
Emma, a question for you from Hutch from the Brotherhood of St Lawrence. The New South Wales budget delivered the $50 million in 2020-21 to establish a one-off time-limited social sector transformation fund to help charities adapt and respond to the challenges of COVID-19. Is that something VCOS had lobbied the Treasurer for here?
Yeah, we had. We completed a sort of budget companion piece because we did our initial budget submission pre-COVID, so we undertook another one afterwards, and we are very mindful of the costs of PPE and cleaning, and working to get a kind of an additional kind of workforce that you can stand up because of the impacts of COVID as well. So that's something I think that is really important actually to community sector organisations, and also to call out. We know that a number of organisations have actually dipped considerably into their reserves to continue operating and to continue serving their communities. So that's obviously not desirable. That's not, what those reserves are there for. I think it shows that the purpose, that not-for-profits exist for, that they would do that in the first place. But nonetheless, their basic operating costs should be met. And when it comes to the pandemic and it comes to the cost of PPE and additional cleaning and other things as well, I think that would be incredibly valuable. So I think there's opportunity for government to step in and do that out of the budget cycle as well as leading into the next one. One of the things, I guess, going to the points that both David and Danielle made, albeit in a comment around, stamp duty kind of versus land tax, is around, I think, the space that there was to sort of consider everything in the lead up to budget. There's so many big ticket items. I would hope there's still space to explore that, even though we're now post-budget, because I think government has a very strong understanding about how vital and important community sector organisations are and actually meeting those costs. I don't think that the government wants to see them go under, and it's going to be really important to actually match the true costs of delivering services and the impact of the pandemic. So in answer to Hutch's question, absolutely yes. I'm hopeful that opportunity hasn't gone just because it wasn't mentioned in the budget. Being mindful we've got another one coming up in May, but organisations, they need that cash and they need it now.
Looking ahead, what level of funding do you think we'll see for mental health going forward with the Royal Commission bringing down its final report? How much money, ballpark, do you anticipate the government's going to have to spend? And can they ever live up to the rhetoric of fixing the system? David, do you want to...
I think so.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to jump in and go. I think so, because I think in terms of addressing many of the problems we've got, it comes down to the will of being able to do that. And we've seen the government step up. We've got the Royal Commission about to hand down their findings, and the government said that they'll meet what those outcomes are. My guess would be, in part, looking at the social housing announcement, I think that was anticipating part of what will be in the Royal Commission into mental health. And it is, as I know when Minister Foley had the portfolio, he often talked about it not operating as a system. I think we have to look at the fact that we need it to be a continuum throughout people's life course. And again, I think the pandemic shone a particular light on it. So I've got real confidence in terms of what the Royal Commission will actually hand down and government's commitment to deliver. I think the challenge will always be, where you put the money, and that importance of, and I would hope the Royal Commission, the final report, really balances out the sort of that prevention, early intervention alongside the tertiary need, because we know that money, for a variety of reasons, often gets pushed to that tertiary end, and it's really important looking at actually the whole system and how our community and how it operates as well. Sorry, I jumped in. I didn't realise. I thought your question was to me in the first place. Sorry.
No, I was coming to you. That was great. David, do you have a view on that? And I guess a long-term funding model. What's the government going to have to do there to ensure that there is sustainable funding for mental health?
Look, they've set up a really interesting and successful model for progressive social reform. It involves setting up a Royal Commission and then committing in advance to supporting its recommendations and funding it. There's enough money in the forward estimates, uncommitted funds, for them to be able to support that. I have no doubt that they will. In fact, the Victorian government stands in contrast to the federal government, which sets up Royal Commissions and then often doesn't do what the Royal Commissions recommend. And just as a little bit of an aside, it was interesting just the other day, there's one of the big private aged care companies is subject of a takeover from another company. And they're doing it on the back that they think that the recommendations of the Royal Commission are going to fatten the profits of that company. That sort of thing is really worrying to me, I must say. But I don't think you see that same thing happening in Victoria, where progressive reforms are nailed by a Royal Commission and then they bankroll it because it's been done well.
And Danielle?
Look, I don't have that much to add other than the fact that the federal government also is looking at this issue. It wasn't via Royal Commission, but it was through Productivity Commission review, and that's obviously also talked about big increase in investment in the sector. So, it's long overdue, clearly at both a state and federal level. So I think it is something where we will see more action in coming years, and rightly so.
And a quick last one maybe for you all just before we wrap up. What measure in this budget do you think will help people who are experiencing ongoing disadvantage before the pandemic hit? Danielle, do you want to start us?
Look, it's hard to go past the social housing, to be honest. It was long overdue. It was a very acute need. We know there was a very, very long and growing waiting list in Victoria, and we also know that getting people into homes is kind of step one for rebuilding other aspects of their life. So, and it's a big investment. So, I think for me that's probably the real kind of signature piece of this budget.
Emma?
Probably social housing and energy, because we know that those energy costs are often the canary in the coal mine when people aren't doing so well. And I think when you combine both of those as well, that's going to just make just such a significant difference. So I would probably combine both of those. Yeah.
And David, do you have?
Yeah, I'm just going to be a little bit more general, because I think this budget, compared to all other budgets, what struck me was the amazingly long list of initiatives, and they're so well thought out. Like, I just couldn't keep up with them right across all the portfolios. Previously, if you got about 1.5 billion for new initiatives, that was fantastic. There's 15 billion in this budget. So all the ones that Danielle and Emma have mentioned, absolutely. But the thing that really impresses me is that they all look to be very well thought through. They haven't been implemented, but the concepts behind them are fantastic. But it shows to me a government really firing on all cylinders and a public service doing the same.
Fantastic. David Hayward, Danielle Wood, Emma King, thank you all very much for your time and for your insights. Thank you very much as well to everybody who's contributed questions today. They've been very good. They've touched on a lot of issues. I hope you've got something out of what the panel and the Treasurer have had to say, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks for joining us.